Have you had that experience where when reading a book or watching a film, you get to a chapter or a scene and you just have no idea why they put it in there? You just can't comprehend what it's doing in the story. It just doesn't make sense. Whether it's the big excess of world building in one of Tolkien's novels, or I'm a fan of the musical Les Miserables, but I couldn't possibly read the book because it just goes on for chapters and chapters of historical Civil War narrative, which sounds pretty dull, to be honest. Hi, I'm James, and today as we look at chapter 18, well, hi, I'm James, and today as we look at chapter 18 of Exodus, and reply to Hemant's latest video, what we're going to look at is a little bit of that. What is this chapter doing in the Bible? Why is it here? But first, let's hear from Hemant and his concluding comments about this section of the story.
What was the point of that trip? Jethro came to the mountain to basically hear Moses tell a story and to offer legal advice. Then he left. This does not advance the plot. And now we're done. The Bible could have been so much shorter if they got rid of the repetition and eliminated the minor characters and just moved things along. This is a perfect example of a chapter no one needed.
Hemant poses an interesting question. Should this be in the Bible at all? Surely nothing happens. But what's interesting is that the chapter is centered around Jethro's visit. So it's like a mini episode within the overall narrative of Exodus. And the major beats that Hemant pointed us to, the arrival and then the dealing with the legal thing, those are the key moments in the story. I'd like to suggest that this section is worthy of being part of the Bible, and there are lots of theological reasons that we could argue about, but I'd like to suggest instead a test for consistency with itself. So, for instance, I'm not a huge fan of anchovies. I wouldn't want to eat them. But if a recipe says how to cook them well, just because I'm not going to use that recipe doesn't mean that the recipe isn't inherently correct in the way that you'd go about cooking them. Now, if the instructions said something like, cook them for 40 minutes at 250 Celsius, you're probably going to burn them. And that's a bad recipe. That's inherently incoherent with itself. But I'd like to suggest that like a good recipe, chapter 18 of Exodus fits within the whole Bible picture. It's got some themes that are key to the whole story, and they centre around Jethro. Now, a feature of the whole Bible is God's plan of salvation for the world, not just for Israel, but for all people. And this is what we get a glimpse of in this chapter. Now, Jethro, we're told in verse 1, he's the priest of Midian being near Egypt somewhere. Jethro, by nature, he's clearly not an Israelite. But the reason he comes to visit Moses is because he's heard of all that God has done and how Israel has been saved and brought out of Egypt. And he comes down through the story, and in verses 9 through 12, we hear he was delighted to hear the good things the Lord had done for Israel, rescuing them from the hands of Egypt. So this story is about a man who is not one of Israel. He's not part of the people of Israel. Someone from outside coming to trust in the God of the Bible. This is a key theme right the way from Genesis through to Revelation. God's promise to Abraham was that he would be the beginning of a blessing for all nations. At the end of the Bible, we hear of the multitudes from all tongues and nations coming together to worship the Lord. In Ephesians chapter 3, we hear of the mystery that is the Jews and the Gentiles, so that is the non-Jews, coming together as the church under God. Now, I'm not asking you to believe these things are true, but I am saying that this story features very heavily this theme of an outsider being brought in. And that is why in verse 12 we see this sacrifice meal. This looks like a peace offering, which we'll see a little bit of in Leviticus. But what that means is offering a sacrifice to God, which is a sign of devotion, and a meal using the meat from the animal, featuring people coming together for social time, which is why Aaron and the elders of Israel come to eat with Moses and his father-in-law. You see, what we have here is a man who is not part of Israel coming to the community to assent to the wonders of this God and to join the covenant community in some way. It's a radical moment in which we're told that the promises of salvation through God are available to all people, not just to Israel. And this is what drives the whole story. You see it from verses 13 onwards. Moses and Jethro are looking at the way that Moses does his judging duty. And it's Jethro that offers a solution so that Moses doesn't get worn out. You see Jethro's concern at verses 18. You and the people who come here would only wear yourselves out. Well, they were mating morning and evening just to hear a judgment. So he's concerned that they don't tire themselves, which is why he suggests they establish this system. That would be a very strange thing for somebody who's not part of the community to offer, and even stranger for someone to take up. But Moses accepts it because Jethro has joined the community, God's community, in the story. And that is really the key that flows right the way through the passage. That is what makes this chapter an important part of the story. And the reason for that is because it's God's story. The claim of the Bible is that it is written by God, and the claim of the Bible about God's aim in writing to us is that he's concerned that people hear about salvation. So while this chapter looks a little bit peculiar, perhaps, it's not quite the bombastic stuff that we've had before so far, but it functions very much so as a key part of God's overall story. Now, as I say, I'm not asking you to believe it. I'm not asking you to believe that God wrote this book and that he offers salvation. I believe he does, and I'd love to talk about that more with you if you would like. But what I'm just trying to suggest today is that it's coherent within itself. It achieves the aims that the rest of the Bible says that it achieves. There's nothing here that is incoherent with the rest of the Bible. There's nothing here that's incoherent with who God is. And that is a good evidence for why it's worth digging into these things a little bit deeper, taking these things further, and working out whether there is actually truth in it. If it were completely incoherent, then yeah, we'd have cause for concern. Hemant makes the amusing point at the beginning that Moses' father-in-law is referred to as Jethro in verse 1, but that in chapter 2 of the same book he was introduced by a different name. He was introduced by the name Reuel. Now, that would be quite peculiar. Not terribly so, because through the rest of the Bible you see many people have different, multiple names. What makes that more coherent in context is Reuel is very clearly Jethro just in the next chapter. So, when we recognise the validity of something sitting in the context it sits in, we can then take those smaller questions a little bit further, just to see whether it does make sense and whether there is something here to be taken seriously. Well, that's a very small point in a very big chapter, in a very big book, but I hope that there's something helpful there for you. I'd love to know what you think about this chapter. I'd love to know what you think about Hemant's video. Do please put a comment if you've got something to say. If you enjoyed it, then do leave a like so that I know. And consider subscribing. I'm aiming to post weekly, along with what Hemant's putting out. And if you'd like to keep up to speed, that's probably the best way to do so. I look forward to looking at the next chapter next week.